the mysterious death in the gym. I don't know why I ever agreed to take that late-night shift. Maybe I thought I could catch up on some grading, or maybe I was just avoiding going home. Either way, that decision would haunt me forever. It was a Wednesday evening in late autumn when the events began. The gymnasium was empty, save for the hum of the fluorescent lights above. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows, and a storm was brewing. It was the kind of night that felt like it belonged in a horror movie. A sense of tension hanging thick in the air, just waiting for something terrible to happen. I was the school's janitor at Eastbrook High, and while I wasn't supposed to work nights, I had gotten into the habit of staying late. Most of the teachers were gone. The students had left, and the building felt like a massive, hollow shell, echoing with silence. It wasn't an unpleasant silence. It was a relief after the chaos of a school day. But sometimes that silence would make you feel like something was waiting, watching you from the shadows. The gym was my final stop on nights like this. My routine was simple: sweep the floors, wipe down the bleachers, and make sure everything was locked up tight before I left. I had almost finished the work when I heard it. First, it was so faint that I wasn't sure I had actually heard anything. A soft sound like a ball bouncing on the floor. It was coming from the center of the gym, where the basketball court lay. The basketball hoops loomed in the half-darkness, and the court was covered in shadows that stretched long across the floor. I paused, my broom frozen in midair. Can't be, I thought. I looked around the gym, the empty bleachers, the high windows where the storm had started to pick up again. And yet, the sound persisted. Bounk, bounk, bounk. The rhythm was unmistakable. It was a basketball being bounced against the wooden floor. Now, I've been in that gym hundreds of times. I know the sounds it makes. I know when a ball bounces, when someone is running around. But this was different. It felt like it came from nowhere, like something or someone was in the middle of the court, playing a game. I had to check it out. I wasn't scared. Not at first, but the further I walked into the gym, the more unsettling the sound became. It was as if it was growing louder and more erratic, as though whoever or whatever was playing didn't want me to get closer. My heart began to race. I stepped onto the court, the old wooden floor creaking beneath my shoes. And just then, the sound stopped, dead silence. The gym felt suddenly colder. The air seemed thicker, like it was pressing down on me. I scanned the room, my eyes darting over the bleachers, the equipment storage. But there was no one at all. I turned back toward the doors, ready to leave. But as I did, I felt a cold draft sweep over my face. It was sharp, icy, like the air was coming from somewhere unnatural. And then, I saw it, in the far corner of the gym, next to the basketball hoop. There was a shadow, a dark figure standing completely still. I froze, unable to look away. The figure was tall, too tall to be a student. But what struck me most was the way it stood, rigid, like it wasn't even breathing. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. I told myself it was a trick of the light, or maybe someone had broken into the school. But then the figure turned, slowly, deliberately. It twisted at the waist and looked directly at me. His face was blurred, like a shadow that had taken form. And the expression, I couldn't make out any features, but I felt it. I felt its presence. A dark, heavy weight pressing in on me. It was a feeling I couldn't explain, but it was as if I had been seen, really seen, for the first time in years. And it was terrifying. The figure didn't move, at least, not right away. But then, without warning, it flickered, like a faulty light bulb. One moment it was there, and the next, it was gone. No footsteps, no sound, nothing. I bolted. I ran out of that gym so fast that I almost tripped over myself, not stopping until I was standing outside in the cold night air, gasping for breath. My hands shook, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up, as if something was right behind me. I couldn't explain what had happened. It didn't make sense. I had never believed in ghosts. Not really. But something in that gym had changed that night. Something was wrong. I went home that night and tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow. I saw it standing in the corner of the gym, staring at me with those empty eyes. And every time I thought about the basketball bouncing on its own, the hairs on my neck would prickle with fear. The next morning, I tried to put it out of my mind. I convinced myself I had imagined it. The storm had probably played tricks on me, and my mind had wandered. But when I came back to the school the following day, I learned something that made my blood run cold. That night, when I had heard the basketball bouncing and seen the figure, the gym had been completely empty. The school was locked up tight. There were no students left, no faculty, no one, except for me. But that wasn't the worst part. As I was walking through the gym that morning, trying to shake off the unease, I spotted something out of the corner of my eye. There, on the floor near the basketball hoop, was a single scuff mark. It was a clear, fresh imprint of a shoe, as if someone had walked across the floor, but no one had. I looked around, expecting to see a janitor's cart. Maybe someone had come in to clean, but there was nothing. And that's when I remembered what had happened last year. A student, a freshman, no older than 14, had fallen during gym class. He had been running for the ball, lost his footing, and slammed his head hard against the floor. The injury was severe. They tried to rush him to the hospital, but it was too late. He had died. They said it was a freak accident. Everyone said it was just one of those things. But what if that accident wasn't an accident at all? What if something had been waiting for him in that gym, watching him, waiting to pull him down into the darkness? I had never believed in ghosts, never believed in spirits lingering in places they shouldn't. But now, as I walked away from the gym, I couldn't help but feel that something was still there, watching, waiting, and it wasn't done with me. Story number 2. The haunting laughter in the classroom. It was late in the afternoon, and I was just about finished preparing my classroom for the next day. I had always found solace in the quiet that followed a school day, when the hustle of children's laughter and chatter faded into a hushed stillness. It was a peaceful time for me, a teacher at Oakwood Elementary in New York. My students were out, and I had the space to gather my thoughts and prepare for the next day's lesson. I had taught there for over 10 years, and nothing had ever seemed out of the ordinary until that particular afternoon. It was a gray, overcast day, the kind that makes everything look washed out, and the skies seemed to press down on you. I was putting my things together, stuffing papers into my bag, when I heard it. A soft laugh, not loud, but definitely there, came from the far corner of the room, the spot where the windows met the back wall. The laughter was high-pitched, almost childlike, but it was laced with something else, something strange. It was the kind of laugh that made your skin crawl, not because it was scary, but because it was wrong, like hearing a child laugh when no one was there to laugh with them. I stopped, my hand frozen mid-motion as I stood by the desk. I looked around the room, suddenly aware of the silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the overhead fluorescent lights. I glanced back toward the corner, but saw nothing, just rows of empty desks, the faint shadows stretching across the floor. "Hello," I called out, my voice thick with confusion. I thought maybe one of the other teachers had left something behind, or perhaps one of the students had sneaked back in to grab something. No response, only the echo of my own voice. I brushed it off as a trick of my tired mind. Maybe I was just too exhausted from the week's lessons. Maybe the stress of the day had caught up with me. After all, it had been a long week of teaching third graders, energetic, curious, and often loud. But the laugh stayed with me. I was about to turn back to finish packing when I heard it again. This time, it was louder, more distinct. Ha, ha, ha. The sound lingered in the room, like it was coming from the walls themselves. I dropped my bag. I didn't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't the thing that followed. My heart slammed against my ribs as I slowly turned toward the source of the sound. My stomach twisted with unease. There, sitting at the back of the classroom, was a chair, one of the student desks, and in the chair, I could have sworn I saw a figure. It was just for a second, barely a flicker, but I saw it, a little girl, small, with dark, matted hair hanging over her face, sitting perfectly still. Her hands were folded in her lap, her feet dangling just above the floor. My breath caught in my throat. I could feel a cold sweat starting to form on the back of my neck. I blinked, and when I looked again, the chair was empty. I stood frozen, unsure of whether I had really seen anything at all. Maybe my exhaustion was finally getting the better of me, but the laughter, it kept ringing in my ears. It wasn't just a sound now. It was a feeling, presence, something that clung to the air like fog. I grabbed my things and made my way toward the door, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread that gripped my chest. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard it once more, so close now. Felt like the voice was right behind me. Ha, ha, ha. I spun around, but the room was empty. The desks were arranged neatly, just as they had been when the children left. There were no shadows moving in the corners. The windows were still shut, and the light was still flickering faintly above me. I don't know what made me turn toward the wall, but I did. There, on the chalkboard, written in faint chalk, were 3 words: "Help me, Mississippi." My blood ran cold. I know I'm not imagining this. I know what I saw, what I heard, and the words on the chalkboard, those words that weren't there just moments ago. I stumbled back, my heart racing, my breath coming in short gasps. I ran out of the room, slamming the door behind me, but the cold that had settled in my bones stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I walked into my classroom and looked around. Everything was just as it had been the day before, except now there was a sense of heaviness in the air, as though the walls themselves were watching me. I had to report it. I had to tell someone, even if it meant they would think I was losing my mind. I spoke with the principal, who listened to my account with a blank expression on his face. He didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, but when I finished speaking, he simply nodded. "I think you should know," he said, his voice low. "We've had incidents here before, not just here, but in other parts of the school too. Some of the staff and even some of the students have reported things, strange things, things they couldn't explain. I've heard the rumors, and the school records have something strange in them." He paused, as if he were unsure how to continue. "Miss Weaver," he began, his eyes darkening with some unspoken memory. "There was a student, her name was Lily Bennett. She was a 3rd grader, just like your class. She was a bright, bubbly child, but she disappeared one afternoon, several years ago. No one knows what happened. The police were never able to find her." I felt my stomach drop. "She was last seen in your very classroom, on the day she disappeared." He continued, "Her family, they've never been the same. They've never been able to move on from it. They believe her spirit is still here, somewhere in the school." I stared at him, unsure if I could even process what he was saying. My mind was reeling. "She was never found, Miss Weaver, but we did find one thing, a message. It was written on the wall of your classroom." My blood ran cold. We didn't know what it meant at the time, but after you reported hearing the laughter, after you found that chalk message, we began to wonder if it was a warning. I didn't want to hear any more. I didn't want to believe it, but I couldn't ignore it. The truth was staring me in the face. The little girl, the one I had seen or thought I saw, had been Lily Bennett. She had been dead for years. Her spirit, her laughter, had been haunting my classroom, waiting for someone to hear her cry for help. And now, it was my turn to answer. The following week, I left Oakwood Elementary for good. I couldn't bring myself to step foot in that classroom again. I couldn't stand the idea that Lily's ghost might still be lurking, waiting for someone to listen to her. But I still hear the laughter sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet. It echoes in my ears, a soft, high-pitched laugh that brings chills to my spine. And every time I hear it, I wonder, did I do enough? Or did I simply leave behind the one thing Lily needed most? The one thing that might have helped her spirit find peace. Story number 3. The glimmering light in the chemistry lab. It was the kind of evening that seemed like it could drag on forever. The school had emptied out hours ago, the buzzing of students and the hum of the vending machines long gone. Just me and the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights flickering above, casting long, sterile shadows over the empty hallways. I didn't mind it much, though. I'd gotten used to being alone at Del Mar High, especially after the last bell. My chemistry lab was at the far end of the building, tucked away behind the science wing where most people rarely ventured. That's how I liked it. Peaceful, almost meditative in its isolation. But that night was different. I had just finished tidying up my lab after the final experiments of the day. The room smelled faintly of acetone and the sharp metallic tang of old copper. The sound of my movements was soft, the clink of glassware and the shuffle of papers barely noticeable in the stillness. I wiped down the countertops, wiped away the residue from spilled sodium bicarbonate, and washed the beakers and flasks one by one. My mind was wandering, running through lesson plans for the next week, checking my email on autopilot. It was the kind of mindless routine that kept me grounded, helped me ignore the gnawing feeling that had settled in my chest over the past few days. I wasn't sure when it started. It was subtle at first, a flicker of light, a strange shadow in the corner of the room. I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me, but something inside me told me to be cautious. Del Mar High had been standing for almost a century. Old buildings often made noises. The pipes creaked, the wiring groaned. But it was never just that, was it? I had never been one for ghost stories. I didn't believe in spirits or the supernatural. I had too much science running through my veins to entertain such things. But the incident in that chemistry lab would challenge everything I thought I knew. It happened just as I was wiping down a beaker, the smooth glass still cool in my hand. I was halfway across the lab, my back turned to the old display case where I kept the antique glassware. I had forgotten about it for the most part. Old things had a way of collecting dust in that place. But that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. I heard a soft click. It was so faint, I thought I might have imagined it. But I didn't. The noise was coming from the back of the room, from the cabinet where I had stored the old chemistry instruments and glass pieces. I turned, expecting to see one of the lab's old Bunsen burners somehow sparked on its own. But when I glanced over, the only thing I saw was a soft, eerie glow coming from the corner of the room. I froze. First, I thought it was the reflection of light bouncing off the windows from the street lamps outside. But it didn't make sense. The light wasn't right. It was too dim, soft, and yet it seemed to pulse, like it had a life of its own. I took a step forward, my heart skipping a beat in my chest, my breath a little shallower than before. As I walked closer, I saw it more clearly, a small, glass lamp, the kind that had been sitting on the shelf for years. I didn't remember turning it on. In fact, I hadn't even touched it in months. It was one of the old, fragile pieces of glassware that no one bothered with. The kind of thing you might see in a dusty science museum, antique and irrelevant. But there it was, glowing with an unnatural light, casting a faint halo against the dimness of the room. I approached slowly, my fingers reaching out, instinctively drawn to it. As my hand neared the light, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I couldn't explain it, but the air felt wrong, cold, almost stagnant. And then, as if reacting to my touch, the light suddenly flickered and snuffed out. The sudden darkness was like a punch to my gut. It felt as though the room itself had been holding its breath, and then it exhaled, releasing something into the air. But that wasn't the worst part. As the light went out, I saw it, in the far corner of the lab, where the glass cabinet met the wall. A figure stood. It wasn't a person, not exactly, at least, not at first glance. It was more like a shadow, or a blur, a dark shape that was almost human, but its outline wasn't clear. It flickered in and out, like it couldn't decide whether it was part of the room or something else entirely. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my hands still hovering in the air. I was frozen. My mind was screaming at me to move, to run, to do something, but I couldn't. I couldn't look away from the figure. It was standing so still, yet it felt like it was watching me, too. I took a step back, but my foot caught the edge of the counter, sending a jar of chemicals crashing to the floor. The sharp noise shattered the silence like a gunshot. The figure in the corner twitched, or perhaps it didn't. It was hard to tell in the low light, but it moved. That was when I ran. I bolted for the door, yanking it open with a force I didn't know I had, and nearly tripped over myself as I scrambled into the hallway. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing under the cold night sky, breathing in the fresh air like I had been underwater for too long. It wasn't until I was safely in my car, locked inside, staring back at the dark outline of the school, that I let myself breathe again. I didn't return to that lab for a week. The thought of it made my skin crawl. I was afraid to go back, afraid that whatever I had seen that night would still be there, waiting for me. The school tried to make light of it. They said it was probably just an old fuse going out or the overhead lights messing with my head. But I knew better. I couldn't explain what I saw in the chemistry lab, and I didn't try. I just stayed away from that room and from that light. But the nightmares, they didn't stop. Every night, I dreamt of that place, the dim, flickering light, the shadow in the corner. I'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, and for a few seconds, I could almost swear that I could still see the glow of that lamp, just at the edge of my vision. I couldn't explain what happened that night. I didn't want to. All I knew was that something had awakened in that room. Something ancient, maybe, something that had been lying dormant for years, hidden away behind the glassware and dusty counters. And whatever it wasn't done with me. I haven't taught any night classes since. Story number 4. The Whisper of Mrs. Ellison. They say a teacher's influence lasts long after they're gone. For Mrs. Ellison, that sentiment proved unsettlingly true. I didn't believe the stories at first. They sounded like the usual ghost tales high schoolers passed around to entertain themselves. But by the time I graduated, I had no choice but to accept what I had experienced. St. Margaret's High School was one of those old New England institutions that reeked of history and mildew. The building, constructed in the late 1800s, had seen its share of changes. New wings added, old ones demolished, but the central block, the heart of the school, remained unchanged. That's where room 312 was located, and that's where Mrs. Ellison had taught English for nearly 2 decades. Everyone loved her. Mrs. Ellison wasn't just a teacher. She was a force of nature. Her love for literature was infectious, and even the laziest students couldn't help but be drawn into her discussions about To Kill a Mockingbird or The Catcher in the Rye. She made words come alive, and for many of us, she was the reason we got through the drudgery of high school. Then she got sick. First, no one knew. She kept teaching, her voice as steady as ever, her passion undimmed. But as the weeks passed, we started noticing little things. How she'd sit more often, how her usually vibrant voice grew softer. By the time we learned it was cancer, it was too late. She passed away just 3 months after her diagnosis, leaving room 312 and all of us haunted by her absence. For a while, the room was closed. They brought in a substitute teacher, but no one wanted to use room 312. The school board eventually decided it was silly to keep it empty, so they moved the new teacher, Mr. Grayson, and that's when the whispers began. Started small, just rumors. Someone would claim they felt a cold draft during class, even though the windows were shut. Others said they saw shadows moving across the walls, though there was no one there to cast them. Mr. Grayson brushed it off as nonsense, but you could see the tension in his shoulders every time he walked into that room. I had my first experience with Mrs. Ellison's ghost, or whatever was left of her, late one afternoon. I'd stayed after school to finish a project for the literary magazine, and the library was packed, so I decided to work in room 312. Mr. Grayson had already left for the day, and the classroom was quiet, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the desks. I was typing away on my laptop when I felt it, a sudden chill, like someone had opened a window in the dead of winter. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I glanced around the room, but everything was still. The windows were closed, the door shut. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, so soft I thought I'd imagined it. Paul, my name. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. The whisper came again, more insistent this time. Paul. I turned toward the sound. It was coming from the corner of the room, near the old bookshelf where Mrs. Ellison used to keep her favorite novels. And that's when I saw her, or rather, the shadow of her. It was faint, barely more than a ripple in the air, but I recognized her silhouette. She was standing there, just as she used to during class, her hand resting on the edge of the shelf. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, but then she moved, just a slight tilt of her head, as if she were looking at me. I bolted out of the room, leaving my laptop and bag behind. I didn't stop running until I was halfway down the hall, when I finally worked up the courage to go back. She was gone, but the room still felt cold, and the air was heavy, almost suffocating. I didn't tell anyone. What was I supposed to say? That I'd seen the ghost of Mrs. Ellison? They'd think I was crazy. But over the next few weeks, more students started sharing their own stories. One girl claimed she heard someone whispering lines from Hamlet during a pop quiz. Another said she saw Mrs. Ellison's reflection in the window when she stayed late to clean the whiteboard. Mr. Grayson lasted only a semester before he requested a transfer. The next teacher didn't last much longer. Eventually, room 312 became the stuff of legend. Teachers refused to teach there, and students dared each other to spend a night inside, though none ever did. On my last day of senior year, I decided to visit the room one final time. It was empty, the desks stacked in neat rows, the chalkboard wiped clean. The air was still, but it carried that same heavy weight I'd felt before. I walked to the bookshelf where I'd seen her shadow and ran my fingers along the spines of the old books. "Thank you," I whispered, not sure if I was talking to her or to the memories of what she had been. As I turned to leave, I felt it again, that cold draft, like a breath of winter against my skin. And then, faint but clear, her voice. "You'll do great things, Paul." I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew she was there, watching, just as she always had, encouraging her students even from beyond the grave. Some ghosts, I've learned, don't haunt out of malice or regret. Some haunt because they care too much to leave. Mrs. Ellison was one of them, and room 312 will always belong to her. Story number 5. The Ghost of the Vice Principal. I'll never forget the first time I heard the sound. It was late in the evening, a chilly autumn night in Missouri, and I had just stayed after school to finish some work. The school had already emptied out, no students, no teachers, just the occasional janitor mopping the floors or the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. It was supposed to be a typical, uneventful night, but that sound, those footsteps, would change everything. I was in the teacher's lounge, sitting at one of the round tables, the flickering light above me casting long shadows along the floor. The smell of stale coffee lingered in the air as I pored over some papers. Then, suddenly, I heard it. Click, clack, click, clack. High heels, faint but distinct. The unmistakable sound of someone walking down the hall outside, their shoes tapping against the linoleum floor. I froze, pen suspended in midair. It was too late for anyone to be walking around. Everyone had gone home. The janitor, whose footsteps were heavier, had already locked the doors to the main entrance. I pushed back my chair slowly, the sound too loud in the stillness of the school. I stepped cautiously into the hallway, my heart beating faster with each step. The sound was coming from the far end, near the principal's office. I expected to see someone, maybe the janitor, maybe a student who had forgotten something. But when I rounded the corner, the hallway was empty, completely empty. I turned to leave, trying to shake off the chill creeping up my spine, when I heard it again. Click, clack. This time, it was closer, much closer. I spun around, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one there. I couldn't explain it. I knew I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't the only one who had heard the footsteps. The stories had been circulating for months, whispers among the staff, hushed conversations at lunch. "It's her," they said. "It's Mrs. Hawthorne." Mrs. Hawthorne had been the vice principal of our school for over 20 years. A strict, no-nonsense woman, tall and always impeccably dressed in dark suits and high heels that clicked down the hall like the beat of a drum. No one ever questioned her authority. She had an air about her that commanded respect. But when she passed away suddenly, after a brief battle with cancer, it felt as though the very heart of the school had been ripped out. The halls seemed quieter, emptier without her presence. And yet, the stories about her began almost immediately. Teachers, students, and staff alike began reporting strange occurrences. The sound of high heels echoing down the hallway at night, the distinct smell of perfume lingering in the air, and sometimes, just sometimes, they would swear they saw her figure, a shadow, moving swiftly down the halls as if she had never left. The first time I heard the rumors, I dismissed them. Grief can play tricks on people's minds. But when I heard the footsteps myself, I knew there was something more to it than just collective imagination. Over the next few days, things started getting even stranger. The footsteps didn't stop. They seemed to follow me, lingering in the hallways as I made my way to class, as if Mrs. Hawthorne were pacing the corridors, watching. It was almost as if she was still there, still in charge, even though her body had been laid to rest in the cemetery behind the school. One afternoon, after staying late to prepare for a parent-teacher meeting, I found myself walking down the hall alone, heading toward the principal's office. The lights were dimmer than usual, the quietness of the school almost suffocating. As I walked, I heard it again, those footsteps. Click, clack. This time, the sound was louder, more distinct. My breath caught in my throat as I froze in place, my hand gripping the edge of the wall. I forced myself to take another step, telling myself it was just my imagination, that there was some reasonable explanation. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow, a figure in the hallway. I turned sharply, my heart pounding in my chest. First, I thought it was just a reflection, a trick of the light. But no, it was her, Mrs. Hawthorne. Her silhouette, tall and commanding, stood at the far end of the hallway, her figure blurred in the dim light. I couldn't make out her face, but I could see the outline of her suit, the unmistakable shape of her shoulders. She was standing still, staring at me, watching. "Mrs. Hawthorne?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my efforts to sound confident. "Is that you?" The figure didn't respond. It didn't move, but I could feel it, an oppressive presence, as though something unseen was suffocating the air around me. I backed away slowly, my heart racing in my chest. When I turned to leave, I heard her voice, soft, almost a whisper, saying something I couldn't quite make out. "Get out," she said. It was more like a command than a plea, and it sent a shiver down my spine. I didn't wait to hear any more. I turned and ran, not stopping until I reached the front doors of the school. I stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, before I finally stepped outside into the cold night air. The next morning, I went to school as usual, but the atmosphere was different. The hallways felt colder, the air felt thicker, and the footsteps, they were still there. It was as though she was waiting for someone, but no one else seemed to hear them, not the other teachers, not the students. It was just me. A few days later, I overheard a conversation between two teachers in the break room. They were talking about the rumors that had been circulating for years, the stories about Mrs. Hawthorne's ghost. One teacher, an older man who had worked at the school for decades, mentioned something that made my stomach turn. "She never really left," he said, his voice low. "The thing is, she was a very controlling person. Some people say she's still trying to keep control of this place, even from beyond the grave. She's looking for something, maybe someone." I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. Mrs. Hawthorne had always been the kind of person who had to be in charge. What if her death wasn't the end of it? What if she was still trying to maintain her grip on the school? Even now, the next night, I stayed late again, determined to confront whatever presence was lingering in the halls. As the clock ticked past midnight, I sat in the teacher's lounge, the only light coming from the overhead fluorescence that hummed softly. I waited, and then I heard it. Click, clack, click, clack. The sound of her heels. She was walking again. I stood up slowly, my body tense with fear. I had to know. I had to see it for myself. I followed the sound down the hallway, my footsteps echoing in the empty building. The sound led me to the principal's office. The door was ajar, and I could see a faint light coming from inside. I pushed the door open. There, standing by the desk, was Mrs. Hawthorne. Her back was to me, but I could see the shape of her, her posture as rigid and upright as it had been when she was alive. I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. I stepped forward, and suddenly, her head turned slowly, deliberately. Her face was pale, lifeless, and her eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my blood run cold. "Leave," she whispered, her voice thin and hollow. "This is my school." I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. But before I could turn to run, the door slammed shut behind me. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw her outline in the darkness. Then, nothing. I never went back to that school after that night. Story number 6. The ghost of the old classroom. I never believed in ghosts, at least, not until I started attending Tetsuya High School. And even then, I wasn't sure. I didn't want to be the kind of person who jumped to conclusions or gave in to fear. I always thought that people who claimed to have seen ghosts were either lying or just had too much time to let their imaginations run wild. But then, that room, and her. I'm getting ahead of myself. It started in my sophomore year. Tetsuya High had this old section, a wing of classrooms that no one really talked about. They were at the far end of the school, almost forgotten. The walls were cracked, the windows fogged over with the kind of grime that only years of neglect could create. It wasn't the kind of place that drew attention. In fact, most students avoided it. If you needed to go to the restroom, you'd take the long way around, avoiding that side of the hall entirely. It wasn't always that way. When the school had first been built, the old wing had been one of the most prestigious. But after a student, Mika Kuroda, took her life in one of those classrooms, the school decided to leave it to rot. They said it was for safety reasons, but no one, not even the teachers, ever seemed to go near it. I didn't know any of this when I first arrived at Tetsuya High. I was a transfer student, new to the area, and desperate to make friends. That's how I ended up hanging out with Rei and Kazuki. Rei was the cool, aloof type. Everyone admired her from afar. Kazuki was more like me, awkward and quiet, always observing the world around him. We clicked almost immediately, our bond forged out of shared isolation. One day, as we were walking home from school, Kazuki brought it up. "Have you ever heard the stories about room 305? He asked, his voice low, almost like he was afraid to say it aloud. Rei rolled her eyes. "Not this again. You know that's just an old rumor, right?" "Yeah, I know," Kazuki muttered. "But it's strange. There's something about that place. Something wrong with it. Some people say it's cursed." I had never heard about room 305, and the curiosity inside me grew. "What happened there?" I asked, trying to sound casual. Kazuki looked around as though someone might be listening. Then, in a whisper, he told us the story. It was about a girl, Mika Kuroda, who had been a top student at Tetsuya High. She was beautiful, smart, everything anyone could want to be. But in her final year, something changed. No one really knew what happened. But one day, Mika just snapped. She locked herself inside room 305 and ended her life. The thing is, Kazuki continued, after her death, strange things started happening around that room. People said they felt cold spots, like the air itself was alive with something else. And sometimes, if you're standing by the door, you can hear soft footsteps or the sound of a chair scraping against the floor. Ray scoffed, but I could tell she was uneasy. You're not still going on about this ghost crap, are you? Kazuki didn't respond, but his face was serious. I didn't know what to make of it. I wasn't a believer in things like ghosts, but the way Kazuki described it felt real. The next day, I found myself walking down the hall with Ray and Kazuki, our conversation growing quieter as we neared the end of the corridor. And there it was, room 305. The door was cracked open just enough to reveal the darkness inside. It didn't look like anything special, just a dusty, forgotten classroom, but something about it made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't want to be the first to say it, but I felt it, the cold. It hit me like a wall, a sudden chill that pierced through my coat and sent a shiver down my spine. Ray noticed it too. It's just a draft, she said, but her voice didn't sound convincing. Kazuki didn't say anything. He just looked at the door, his expression tense. Let's go inside, he whispered. I couldn't explain why, but I followed them in. The room was darker than I expected. Despite the light streaming in from the hall, the air was heavy, thick with the scent of dust and old paper. The old wooden desks were scattered haphazardly, covered in grime. The windows were covered in thick layers of dirt, blocking out most of the daylight. As soon as we stepped inside, the door creaked closed behind us, making me jump. Ray went to the window, pulling aside the heavy curtains to let in a sliver of light. Kazuki walked over to one of the desks, his fingers running over the worn wood. And that's when I felt it, the cold spot. It wasn't just the temperature, it was something else, something unnatural. The air felt wrong, like it was pressing in on me, suffocating me. I turned around, half expecting to see something in the corner of the room. That's when I saw it. In the far corner, standing next to the blackboard, was a figure, a girl. Her hair was long and black, hanging down around her face, hiding her expression. She wore a school uniform, just like the one I had on. The sight of her made my stomach flip, and I froze. Kazuki must have felt it too. He turned slowly, his face going pale. Did you see that? He whispered. I didn't respond. Couldn't. The girl Mika didn't move. She just stood there, as though she were waiting for us to speak. I didn't know what to say. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her. And yet, at the same time, I didn't want to look. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, I heard her. Get out. It wasn't a shout. It wasn't even a scream. It was a soft, chilling voice that seemed to come from everywhere. Surrounding us, the air turned cold. Impossibly so. My breath came out in clouds, and I could see Ray shivering beside me. Without a word, we bolted for the door, and as we did, the girl, she disappeared, vanished into thin air, leaving only a sense of emptiness behind. We didn't talk much on the way out, but I knew Ray knew, Kazuki knew, that something had happened, something we couldn't explain. And we knew that room 305 was no longer just a classroom. It was a tomb for Mika Kuroda's spirit, who would never rest. For weeks after that, things got worse. Every time I passed by that classroom, I'd feel the cold. Sometimes, I'd hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing in the hall. I saw the girl's face in my dreams, standing at the edge of my bed, her black eyes staring down at me with a look that I couldn't understand. One day, A rumor started circulating that more students were experiencing the same thing. They'd feel her presence when they passed room 305. Some even claimed to have heard her speak, telling them to leave. Others said they saw her standing in the corner of the room, just as we had. I don't know what happened to Mika Kuroda. I don't know why she died, but I know she's still there, waiting, watching. And if you ever find yourself near room 305 at Tetsuya High, don't linger too long, because if you do, you might just hear that voice again. Get out. Story number 7. The echoes in the hallway. It's always been easy to dismiss ghost stories, to roll your eyes and mutter about the overactive imaginations of people who spend too much time alone in the dark. I used to think that way, too, back when I was just another kid walking the crowded halls of Delton High School in Texas. But that was before I heard the footsteps. You see, Delton High wasn't just another high school. It was an old school, the kind that had been around for decades, built back in the early 60s when the town was just starting to grow. The main building was one of those sprawling, red brick structures with long hallways that seemed to stretch forever. I'd always liked the place, mostly because it was big enough to get lost in, but there was something about those hallways, especially the ones that ran past the science wing and gym, that felt off. You could never shake the feeling that something was watching you when you passed them late at night. I didn't believe in ghosts back then. No one did. At least, no one said it out loud. But there were rumors, whispers behind closed doors. The janitor who swore he saw a figure standing at the far end of the hall late one night. The teacher who claimed she saw a shadow cross the hall, only to find no one there when she went to check. I'd heard all of it, of course, but I figured it was just people getting a little too freaked out in the quiet of the school after hours. That was until I stayed after school for the first time. I'd been in the library late, cramming for a test I'd been avoiding for weeks. The clock above the door said it was nearly 9:30 p.m. when I finally packed up my books and started for the exit. I had my earbuds in, playing some random playlist, my head down as I walked down the long, dim hallway toward the main doors. I'd taken that route hundreds of times before, but that night, something felt different. First, I thought I was imagining things. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was just the exhaustion catching up with me. But I heard something, the faint sound of footsteps, echoing down the hall. It was slow, deliberate, almost rhythmic, like someone was walking just ahead of me. I pulled out my earbuds and listened. Silence. I took another step. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of shoes scraping against the floor, echoing down the hall. It wasn't a loud noise, but it was steady, and it was getting closer. My heart began to beat a little faster. I knew the school was empty, at least I thought it was. No one had said anything about a late night event. I was the only one in the building, right? I stopped, my breath caught in my throat. The footsteps continued. They were moving away from me now, back toward the far end of the hall, just beyond the science wing. It wasn't a hurried step, not an urgent pace, but it was as if something was moving with purpose. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I took a step forward, trying to peek around the corner, but there was no one there, just empty lockers, dim fluorescent lights flickering overhead. The footsteps stopped. For a moment, I stood there, listening. Nothing. But that was the problem, wasn't it? The silence that followed wasn't right. It was too complete, too final, like something had been erased. I shook my head, trying to talk myself out of it. It was just my mind playing tricks. It was just the echo from the other end of the hallway. I started walking again, quicker this time, not wanting to be alone in the hall for any longer than necessary. Then I heard it again, closer this time. A single step, pause, and then a steady march. It was as if the footsteps were following me. I spun around. No one. Hello, I called out, but my voice came out strangled, too high-pitched, as if I was trying to convince myself more than anything. No response. I took a few more steps, heart pounding. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing. that I was just tired, maybe even hearing things. But then it happened again. The unmistakable sound of shoes moving steadily behind me. This time, closer. I didn't wait to look. I didn't care to. I broke into a run, desperate to get to the exit. As I ran down the hallway, I could feel it, a presence. Something following just behind me, breathing down my neck. The sound of footsteps was all around me now, a cacophony of shuffling and scraping, like a dozen people walking in unison. I reached the doors, threw them open, and ran into the parking lot, gasping for air. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped out of the school lot. I didn't sleep that night, couldn't. The next day at school, I tried to shake off what had happened. I was just being paranoid, right? The echoes had to be from someone else. I figured I'd just been too tired, too distracted. But as the day went on, I heard the rumors again, the whispers about the footsteps. Some kids were talking about hearing them in the exact same spot I'd been, and others had heard them too. Everyone had their own version of the story. Someone heard it by the gym. Another person heard it by the old janitor's closet. The stories were spreading fast. And then I learned the truth. A few weeks later, I bumped into Mr. Ellis, the school janitor, in the hall. He was a quiet man, always mumbling to himself, always cleaning or fixing something. But he'd worked there long enough to know the ins and outs of the school. He looked at me, and without saying anything, he leaned in and whispered, "You heard them, didn't you?" I blinked. "The footsteps?" I asked, almost laughing at myself. He nodded. "They started after the kid disappeared." That stopped me cold. "What do you mean?" "Back in '94, he said, his eyes narrowing. "A kid, Bradley Jenkins, he went missing. No one ever found him. They say he disappeared in that hall. No one saw anything. No one heard anything. But after that night, the footsteps started." I didn't say anything. I just stood there, listening. "I'm not crazy," Mr. Ellis continued. "But sometimes, I think Bradley is still walking those halls, trying to find his way out." The chill that ran down my spine wasn't just from the cold air in the hallway. It was the realization that the footsteps I'd heard, the footsteps that had followed me down the hall, were not the echoes of my own footsteps, but someone else's. Someone who had been lost and had never left. I don't know if Bradley Jenkins is still out there, walking those hallways every night. I don't know if anyone else hears the footsteps now. But I do know this: whenever I pass down that same hall late at night, when the lights flicker and the shadows stretch long and cold, I always hear them, the footsteps, and I don't dare look back. Story number 8. Strange marks on the desk. It's funny how the most ordinary things can turn into something that keeps you up at night. I used to think that high school was just about the usual stuff: exams, sports, and a few moments of boredom. But what happened at Briarwood High wasn't ordinary. It was anything but. It all began at the start of my senior year, during the fall semester. I remember it clearly because that was the first time I noticed the scratches. I had just transferred to Briarwood, moving to Michigan from a small town in Ohio, and I wasn't exactly thrilled about the new school. The hallways felt bigger, the teachers stricter, and the students, well, they all seemed to know each other already. I was an outsider, trying to blend in, to make it through the year without too much fuss. But that wasn't to be. I was in Mr. Granger's history class when I first noticed it. It was a Tuesday morning, the air outside crisp and cool, the kind of day where you could feel the onset of winter. I walked into the classroom, the scent of chalk and old books filling my nose, and sat down at my usual desk in the third row. Nothing out of the ordinary. I unpacked my books, pulled out a notebook, and began to scribble down notes. But something caught my eye, a faint scratch on the surface of my desk. I leaned in closer, my pen frozen in my hand. It wasn't just a random mark or a groove from years of use. It looked deliberate, almost as if something or someone had etched it into the wood. The scratch was jagged, unnatural, But the strangest part was the way it almost seemed to pulse. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel my pulse quicken as my fingers hovered over the mark. I looked around, but no one else seemed to notice. The rest of the class was busy with their work, too focused on Mr. Granger's lesson to care about a mark on my desk. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting someone to be watching me, but the classroom was as empty as ever. I dismissed it as a weird coincidence. Maybe a previous student had scratched it there, I thought, but that thought didn't sit well with me. The marks on the desk kept coming back. Each time I came to class, there was something new, something more pronounced. One day, I arrived early, hoping to get a few moments of quiet before the chaos of the school day began. When I sat down, I immediately noticed something different. The scratch wasn't just a scratch anymore. It had morphed into something more, something deliberate. There, etched deep into the wood, were words. "They're watching you." My breath caught in my throat, and I quickly wiped my hands on my jeans. I thought I was imagining it. Maybe I had scratched it myself by accident, and my mind was playing tricks on me. But as the days passed, the words became more frequent, more distinct. Sometimes it was "get out." Other times, it was just a single word, "run." I couldn't explain it. No one else in class ever saw it, but the marks were unmistakable. Sometimes they appeared overnight, fresh scratches that no one had made. Other times, they would change, as if someone were updating the message. And every time I came in to see them, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Someone or something was trying to reach me. It wasn't just the scratches anymore. Strange things started happening to me, too. First, it was subtle. A shadow flickering at the corner of my eye, or the chill that would sweep through the room when I was alone. Then, one afternoon, as I was leaving class, I saw it. The hallway was empty, save for a few straggling students, and I was walking down toward the exit when I caught a glimpse of something moving outside the classroom window. A figure tall, lanky, with a dark silhouette moved past the glass. I froze, my heart thudding painfully in my chest. First, I thought it was just some random person, maybe a janitor or a teacher, but the figure didn't walk like any normal person. It seemed to glide, almost like it was floating, and then, when it reached the corner of the building, it vanished. I felt my stomach churn. I couldn't shake the image of the shadow from my mind. Felt wrong, unnatural, quickened my pace, desperate to get outside, away from the building. That night, as I sat in my room, trying to forget the events of the day, I heard it, a noise, faint but distinct, a tapping, like fingers on wood. I thought it was my imagination, but the sound grew louder, closer, until it felt as though it was right outside my door. I opened the door, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing, no one. I looked down the hallway, into the dark, and saw only shadows. The tapping stopped. The next day, it happened again, but this time, it wasn't just tapping. It was something else, something far worse. During class, as Mr. Granger was lecturing, I looked up at the whiteboard and saw something move, just a flicker, but enough to make me stop breathing. My eyes locked on the corner of the classroom, where a figure stood in the shadow, completely still. I couldn't make out any features, just the dark outline of someone or something watching me. I quickly turned away, trying to focus on the lesson, but I couldn't get the image out of my head. The figure didn't move. It just stayed there, watching. When the bell rang, I practically ran out of the classroom. I needed to get out of there. As I reached my locker, I caught sight of a familiar face, Dylan, one of the kids I'd met in the lunchroom. He was looking at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his voice shaking. I saw it, too. "Saw what?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The shadow," he said. "The thing in the corner. It's been following me for days. I thought I was going crazy, but I saw it in the window, too." My heart sank. It wasn't just me. Dylan had seen it, too. Later that evening, I did something I never thought I'd do. I went back to the classroom. I needed to understand what was happening. It was like an obsession I couldn't shake. I walked through the halls, the familiar echo of my footsteps the only sound. When I reached room 103, I hesitated, the door just a few inches ajar. Slowly, pushed it open, half expecting to see the figure again. The room was dark, the desks empty, but the air was thick, heavy, as if it was waiting for something. I sat down at the desk, and then I heard it, the faintest sound of something scraping across the wood. I looked down and froze. The scratch had appeared again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't a simple message. It was a name. Samantha. I felt my stomach twist. My breath caught in my throat. My name. The realization hit me like a freight train. It was me. The scratches. The shadow. The whispers. It was all for me. I wasn't just some innocent bystander. I was the one being watched. I stood up, backing away from the desk. But the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. The room was plunged into darkness, and I heard it slow, deliberate footsteps coming toward me. I wasn't alone, and that's when I knew whatever was in Briarwood High, whatever had been leaving the scratches, whatever had been following me, it wasn't going to let me leave. Story number 9. Monsters in the school basement. I'll be honest, I never believed in monsters, not the kind with claws or fangs. At least, I was a rational person, a skeptic who didn't scare easily. But after that day in the basement of Pinewood High School, I can't say I feel the same anymore. It all started as an ordinary Friday afternoon. One of those crisp fall days when the air smells of dried leaves and the sun hangs low in the sky. The school day had just ended, and I was with my usual crew, Eli, Tasha, and Josh, when we stumbled upon something we weren't supposed to find. It wasn't the first time we dared to wander around Pinewood's old, creaky hallways. Most of the school was modernized, but there were parts, hidden corners, dusty closets, abandoned classrooms that had a long, forgotten history. Eli was the ringleader of our little group, always daring us to venture deeper into the school's secrets. That afternoon, his eyes were alight with the same mischievous spark that had led us on countless misadventures. "Guys, I found something," Eli said, his voice low and conspiratorial as we hung out by the gym. He led us down a narrow hallway behind the old science labs, a hallway that none of us had noticed before. It wasn't on any map of the school. It didn't even look like it was used anymore. We reached a door weathered, with the kind of rusted doorknob that made the whole thing seem like it had been locked for decades. The sign above it read, "Storage Room 3." But there was something eerie about the way it was labeled. It was as though the door hadn't been opened in years, maybe longer. Eli smirked, and without hesitation, he turned the doorknob. The door creaked open with a sound like nails on a chalkboard, and a musty, stale smell wafted out from the crack. A chill ran down my spine, but curiosity won out. The stairs leading down were narrow and steep, the kind you only find in old buildings. They seemed to descend into the bowels of the school like a forgotten tomb. I glanced at the others. Tasha was already at the foot of the stairs, her wide eyes reflecting the same mix of fear and excitement that mirrored my own. "This is definitely not a good idea," Josh muttered, his face pale. Josh was the most cautious of us all, always the voice of reason, but even he couldn't resist the pull of the mystery. "You scared?" Eli teased. He always loved pushing Josh's buttons. Josh rolled his eyes but didn't protest any further. He followed us down, his footsteps echoing against the stone walls. The further down we went, the darker and colder it became, until I could hardly make out the dim shapes around me. Finally, we reached a small landing. The basement stretched out before us like a forgotten kingdom, filled with relics from Pinewood's past. Old furniture, broken lockers, boxes piled high with textbooks from decades ago. Everything was coated in a thick layer of dust. It looked like something straight out of an old horror movie, the kind of place where you just know something's off, but you can't quite put your finger on it. This place is creepy as hell, Tasha said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was the first to step into the room. Yeah, it feels like we're not supposed to be here, I added, but still, my feet moved on their own, as if drawn by some invisible force. We spread out, poking through old crates, brushing away cobwebs. It wasn't long before Eli found something interesting. A stack of yellowed, faded paintings, all piled haphazardly in one corner. They were portraits, creepy, distorted faces that seemed to watch us as we picked them up. There were no names, no dates, just faces, distorted and twisted in ways that made my stomach turn. Some of them were smiling, but it wasn't a friendly smile. It was cold, predatory. I don't like this, Josh said again, his voice shaking, but we kept going, too intrigued to stop. Eli held up one of the paintings. Look at this one, he said, his voice barely a whisper. The painting was of a man dark, almost skeletal, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly at me, no matter where I stood. The man's lips were stretched into a grin, but his eyes, they were wrong, dead, as if they belonged to something that wasn't human. Then the air shifted. It was subtle at first, a faint shift in temperature, a cool breeze that ran down the back of my neck. I turned around, but no one was moving. The others were still focused on the paintings, oblivious to what I had just felt. Did you guys feel that? I asked, my voice a little too loud in the silence. Josh looked up from his spot and nodded. Yeah, it got cold all of a sudden. Then we heard it. First, it was just a faint rustle, like the sound of paper fluttering. But then it grew louder, closer. It was a shuffle, slow and deliberate. Footsteps, but not footsteps like ours. This was something heavier, dragging. Who's there? Eli called out, his voice tense, but no one answered. We stood frozen, each of us straining to hear. The footsteps stopped, then nothing. For a long moment, the silence pressed down on us like a weight. My heart was pounding so loudly in my chest that I was sure everyone could hear it. Maybe it's just an animal, I said, trying to convince myself. A rat or something. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. That wasn't the sound of a rat. Then it came again, closer this time. The shuffle, the drag. I glanced behind me and saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood in the doorway. It wasn't like any of us. It wasn't even human. It was tall, impossibly tall, and it was hunched over, its limbs unnaturally long. Its face was hidden in shadows, but the faint outline of its body made my stomach churn. It was as if it was made from the darkness itself, like it was born from the shadows of the basement. Go, now. Tasha's voice broke through the air like a crack of thunder. We turned, running toward the stairs, the sound of our feet echoing in the stillness. But as we reached the first step, the figure moved fast, too fast. It lunged toward us, its long arms reaching out, and I felt something cold and clammy brush against my back. I screamed. We didn't look back. We didn't stop. We scrambled up the stairs, one of us tripping over the others, desperate to get out. We slammed the door behind us, locking it without a second thought. We didn't speak as we stood in the hallway, trying to catch our breath. None of us wanted to say it aloud, but we all felt it. Whatever we had seen, whatever that thing was, it had been waiting for us. It had been watching us the whole time. None of us went back into the basement after that day. We couldn't bring ourselves to. And to this day, I still see the shadow of that thing in my nightmares. I don't know what it was, but I do know this: we weren't meant to find it. And something, somewhere, wants us to forget.